crazy. According to Bloomberg, MicroStrategy, that mega-leveraged Bitcoin company, is going to go live on the NASDAQ this Friday, which will then lead to millions of people having indirect Bitcoin exposure. That means you definitely can't ignore Bitcoin anymore. Anyone who has a QQQ or something like the NASDAQ and so on, and other large indices will probably be connected quickly. Anyone who buys these major indices as part of Bitcoin is part of MicroStrategy and has indirect exposure to Bitcoin. And that's what I've always said, hey, you can't get around Bitcoin, and if you don't buy it directly, then you have it indirectly in your portfolio. And now, through the NASDAQ vehicle, millions of people here could have access to Bitcoin. And even Bitcoin critics will now all own Bitcoin. If someone like Peter Schiff is involved in the NASDAQ in any way starting Friday, then he will have Bitcoin exposure. Also, we have about 24 hours left until what's likely to be the biggest Bitcoin news regarding a Bitcoin reserve strategy. Dennis Porter announced that something massive is going to happen in 24 hours, something that really has the potential to change the world. We're going to take a look at what's behind this, but first, let's focus on MicroStrategy. Michael Saylor writes here that MicroStrategy will be joining the NASDAQ 100 QQQ, backed by the ultimate strategic reserve of Bitcoin. The question isn't whether we'll surpass Microsoft's market cap, but how quickly MicroStrategy will exceed that market cap. It's actually not Michael Saylor himself, but the Michael Saylor satire account that posted this. But here, there's actually already an official announcement on the Bloomberg terminals that MicroStrategy will be included in the QQQ this Friday. Will be included in the NASDAQ. So the QQQ basically reflects the performance of the NASDAQ, and it includes other companies like Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Alphabet, and so on. And the statement I just read that MicroStrategy will surpass Microsoft is obviously not from Michael Saylor, because he would definitely make enemies at Microsoft and so on. This is obviously from the satire account, but it's very, very accurate for 2021, because Microsoft has taken a stand against Bitcoin, and MicroStrategy is catching up more and more. Compared to other companies, they're catching up more and more. Michael Saylor is also catching up with his Bitcoin holdings. Compared to, for example, with someone like Bill Gates, Michael Saylor's wealth is probably growing a whole lot faster, like, for example, Bill Gates, or maybe even Elon Musk or someone like that. I'm not 100% sure, but it could definitely be the case. And in the end, you have the choice to either embrace innovation with Bitcoin or just say, no, I'm going to shut myself off from innovations like, for example, Microsoft. And the really special thing is, as already mentioned, there are so many Bitcoin critics who just say, okay, Bitcoin has failed, Bitcoin is going to fade into irrelevance, and so on. But when word gets out that MicroStrategy is not only joining the NASDAQ, but also being added to other major indices, then eventually you have a situation where almost everyone, like every ETF investor, will have Bitcoin exposure. If you just have a standard savings plan, then it's pretty straightforward. You buy, for example, like a QQQ, and then you see a breakdown where there are about 100 companies in the NASDAQ, and it's divided up by market capitalization. And depending on how much market capitalization a company has in this index, they then receive almost continuous buying pressure. So the buying pressure that's now coming to MicroStrategy, there are various figures. Coming in, some are throwing out numbers as high as 20 billion per year, which could mean additional buying pressure, or cash flow flowing into MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy has announced that next year they plan to buy 42 billion in Bitcoin. Cash flow can flow back into MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy has announced that next year they plan to buy 42 billion in Bitcoin. Now, let's imagine that another 10 or 15 billion in new MicroStrategy stock purchases come in. Then, of course, it could also be that MicroStrategy will increase the 42 billion that has now been announced for the next 3 years in the purchase program, so that they will then perhaps buy Bitcoin for 50 or 60 billion. MicroStrategy's rising market cap boosts Bitcoin buys, stock value, and NASDAQ listing, attracting passive flows. This cycle, now expanded with passive flows, evolves from an infinite to a giganfinite money glitch. So the more the market capitalization goes up, the more Bitcoin MicroStrategy can buy, and the more they buy Bitcoin, the more the stock goes up again. The more the stock goes up, the higher the market cap gets, and the higher the market cap, the higher they get listed on the NASDAQ. The higher they are listed on the NASDAQ, the more passive flows come into MicroStrategy. The more passive flows come into MicroStrategy, the more Bitcoin they can buy again. And we should add, the more Bitcoin they buy, the more the stock valuation increases. The more the stock valuation increases because Bitcoin has gone up, the more they can dilute the shares and use that diluted capital to buy even more Bitcoin. And that's basically an endless cycle. The only difference is that this cycle is now being expanded through passive flows. So MicroStrategy already had the infinite money glitch, and now they have the giganfinite money glitch because they've also joined the NASDAQ and the QQQ. And the next step would be, for example, other Bitcoin companies like, for example, Mara Holdings and so on, which are following a similar strategy to Microsoft, could eventually make their way into the NASDAQ, or maybe even other big companies like Amazon has also been considering or voting on whether they will buy Bitcoin, for example. Amazon buying Bitcoin, and they're all listed on the NASDAQ or in major indices, which means that every time you buy an S&P 500, NASDAQ, or any big index, or even an MSCI World, you're indirectly getting Bitcoin exposure through MicroStrategy, Amazon, Mara Holdings, and so on. And that's really bullish that Bitcoin isn't going anywhere, and Bitcoin is finding its way, whether you like it or not, but Bitcoin is making its way into the mainstream. And then we actually have a strong announcement from Dennis Porter, who has made quite a stir before with various leaks or announcements that, let's say, weren't 100% accurate, but maybe about 70% right. He says that in less than 24 hours, the most important Bitcoin announcement will take place. This Bitcoin strategy reserve announcement is going to massively accelerate the global timeline for Bitcoin adoption. So I could see a new state being announced here, either a new state in the US or maybe even a new country that's adopting a Bitcoin reserve strategy. So the question now is, okay, is Russia coming in? Is a new state coming in, maybe China and so on? He says that he's in contact with several countries and I think even about 10 states or something like that. And that's definitely the topic that everything is revolving around right now. So on one hand, Donald Trump is really opening up to Bitcoin. Eric Trump says Bitcoin is going to hit 1 million, while Donald Trump wants a Bitcoin price of $1. At the same time, we're seeing outside pressure for the US to step it up 2021. On the other hand, we also have internal factors like Dennis Porter, who is really pushing the Bitcoin reserve strategy forward. He also says that he will definitely introduce the Bitcoin reserve strategy before Donald Trump, but not at the country level, rather at the state level, like, for example, Pennsylvania or other states will announce a Bitcoin Reserve Act here. And now Donald Trump is facing internal pressure because other states could come before him, and he has external pressure because other countries could come before him. A really, really crazy mix. You always have to, let's say, slow down a bit because it could all be a waste of time. But as I said, with Dennis Porter, we have often seen that these announcements actually fit. He also mentions a major government adopts a Bitcoin reserve strategy by the end of 2025, and a BRICS nation implements it as well. In 2026, dominoes fall, others join and adopt a Bitcoin reserve strategy. Luke DeBroy says if America introduces a Bitcoin reserve, Russia's likelihood increases tenfold. And in 2026, all the dominoes will roll. Then other people will come along and use a Bitcoin reserve strategy here too. And here I found something really interesting, a statement from Luke DeBroy, who says that if America introduces a national strategic Bitcoin reserve, the likelihood of Russia doing the same will increase tenfold. If Russia sets up a national strategic reserve, the likelihood of America doing the same increases tenfold. If America or Russia introduces a national strategic Bitcoin reserve, the likelihood of China doing the same increases tenfold. If America, Russia, or China introduces a national strategic Bitcoin reserve, the likelihood of 10 other countries doing the same increases tenfold. Do you understand what's going on here? We can discuss who will do it first. But it doesn't matter if one of these countries does it, all this wrangling becomes irrelevant and then it's off to the moon. Because a Bitcoin reserve strategy is probably the biggest catalyst we've ever seen for Bitcoin. And yeah, we tend to be pretty bullish on this channel, but just take that in. I actually just heard a crazy statement about Bitcoin on a stock channel. This is actually the channel of Timo Bossis. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Check out this statement here.
So for me, I came up with the following. Trump is actually implementing the Loomis plan. Bitcoin essentially becomes a reserve. The Fed buys Bitcoin reserve. The mere announcement of that would cause Bitcoin to really have an incredible bull run. So I've noted here that it quickly forms a solid flagpole. But then it gets hit hard again because Congress suddenly remembers that this legislative initiative might be, well, a bit shaky. So even though Congress is also Republican, it might be taken away again. And that would also lead to Bitcoin taking a significant hit again. I think everyone, this is really, let's say, kind of in the realm of fantasy. But now that's the way it is with House of Cards. People always thought that it was fantasy. And in the end, reality has overtaken fiction a little bit. So let's take a look.
So it seems like even the traditional financial world is starting to get FOMO about Bitcoin and is becoming massively bullish. In the beginning, it was just some cyberpunks or people who maybe speculated about a Bitcoin reserve strategy at some secret meetings 3, 4, or 5 years ago. Back then, we were already talking about Bitcoin with Lendon and a block trainer. He had suggested it about 3 years ago in a roundtable discussion with Alex Frankenberg and others, discussing how the US could implement a Bitcoin reserve strategy. Actually, I think he was the first one I heard of who threw that idea out there here in Germany. Maybe there were others who brought it up earlier, but that was 3 years ago. Maybe there were people who discussed this 4 or 5 years ago. Then it naturally kept moving further into the mainstream. Now Bitcoin enthusiasts are talking about it, and now the media is starting to cover it, and even the traditional finance folks are getting in on the conversation. The discussion is about when and who will introduce a Bitcoin reserve. Is it coming in a year, or is it coming in 6 months? But right now, the discussion isn't about whether it will happen or not. It's just about when it will happen and who will be the first to introduce a Bitcoin reserve. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link down below to 21 Bitcoin, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. Super simple. And here you can also save up to 20% on the fees with the code Bitcoin Hotel. Great recommendation. And also, feel free to check out our Bitcoin Hotel shop, linked below. They have awesome merch, t-shirts, hardware wallets, security gadgets, and so on. All sorts of things, our Princess Bitcoin Hotel, and much more. Leave me a subscription. See you later. Peace out.